In this week's episode of Bleach the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Kisuke releases his Bankai to battle Askin, Haschwalth reveals a shocking new transformation, and Ichigo and Orihime finally face off against Yhwach. Look, I won't sugarcoat it, I was pretty open about episode 42 being my personal favourite of the three that were released in the cinema last month, and that's really down to the fact that it's a coming together of so many elements that are themselves many of my personal favourites, brought to life in a genuinely pitch-perfect way. Kisuke Urahara, one of my favourite characters, finally releases his Bankai, Kanon Biraki Benehime Aratame, my favourite Bankai in the series, and the one I'd been waiting to see animated the most. He's battling Askin Naklavar, my favourite Sternritter, and this was one of, if not my favourite fights of the Varvelt arc, which again I'd been dying to finally see on the screen. So, we're off to a pretty good start. But on top of that, this episode also includes some more exciting new content for Uryu vs Haschwalth, including taking Haschwalth in a genuinely surprising direction that feels like a massive divesting from the manga. Plus, Ichigo and Orihime arrive at Yhwach's throne room, setting up really the rest of the core to come. To cap it all off, episode 42 is the best looking episode of the bunch as well, with many shots specifically from Urahara vs Askin, feeling like they are taken straight from the manga, while the fight itself is animated beautifully. I'm already gushing about the episode as you can see, so enough talk, let's just dive right in. And so as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the Thousand Year Blood War arc episode 42, Son of Darkness, as always I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the Thousand Year Blood War arc manga, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. If you like this video, if you want to help support the channel that extra step further, Patreon is one of the best places to do it. Do consider going over there. Check out the link in the description down below. Your help is massively appreciated. It does make a huge difference, and I really can't thank you all enough. Alright, let's begin this review in earnest then, and as always we'll start by taking a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode. And once again, we're looking at a fairly compact package. We're only 2 episodes in, of course, but the final core is doing something pretty interesting with its structure. While events are technically playing out the same way as they do in the manga, so Askin's battle is first, and then it seems to me that Gerard's fight will probably be concluded for all intents and purposes in the next couple of episodes. What's happening here is that we're also seeing Uryu vs Haschwalth and Ichigo and Orihime vs Yhwach running concurrently to these other fights, reinforcing the idea that yes, everything is happening all at once, rather than sequentially, as it kind of felt in the manga. Ichigo and Orihime don't even arrive at Yhwach's throne room until the Gerard fight is over in the manga. And while I don't have a problem with the manga structure, this definitely feels a bit more organic, and perhaps less like a video game, with the final boss only taking place right at the very end. I think that's potentially only one reason for them doing it like this, though. It's totally possible that there is more going on here than we know, and the anime wants the endings of certain fights to coalesce at just the right time. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. But without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 42. First we have chapter 664, The Gift, chapter 665, The Princess Dissection, chapter 666, Empty Puppet Temple, chapter 672, Son of Darkness, the episode's title, chapter 673, Father, and finally, chapter 674, Father 2. Now that sounds like a lot, but the reality is quite different. The only chapters adapted in full in this week's episode are chapters 664 and 665. Every other chapter involved here is missing at least a page, but in basically every single instance it's actually quite a bit more than that. Again, by the time we reach chapters 672 and 673 in the manga, Gerard's fight is over, which makes me wonder what the team has planned, if anything, for the back half of Gerard's fight. Is there a chance someone like Isshin does in fact get involved? Or is the entire Gerard fight just going to be wrapped up by the end of episode 4? Speaking of which, I've mentioned this before, but chapter 674 is still literally the furthest the anime has gotten to so far. The cliffhanger ending of this chapter featuring the arrival of Isshin and Ryuken, which happened back in episode 40. So we're encroaching upon that furthest point, but we haven't yet breached it. And I can't help but wonder again if that's a conscious decision, if beyond chapter 674 is maybe when things are going to start getting even more different. Anyway, let's move on to the spoiler analysis itself, as we take a deeper look at episode 42 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc titled Son of Darkness. Before we do that, consider hitting subscribe down below to help push us to 300,000 subscribers, a goal that's only going to be met with your help if you're new here, or you just haven't yet hit subscribe. If you're part of the 50% of my viewership that's not yet subscribed, it would be greatly, greatly appreciated. So do please consider hitting that button down below if you enjoy the channel, if you enjoy the content, and you want to help support more videos like this in the future to come. So the episode begins with a brand new sequence, which starts with a flashback, this time showing us Orihime and Tatsuki enjoying a greenhouse. Again, like I said in my live discussion, it's very nice to see Tatsuki again, Core 4, continuing to bring back characters who simply are not involved during this part of the manga, so it's great to see her here. Both Orihime and Tatsuki are in their school uniforms, and a couple of girls walk by also in school uniforms, so is this greenhouse on school grounds, or are they visiting in the middle of the school day? I would have said they're on a school trip, but Tatsuki mentions them having double period classes to get to, so I really have no idea. It seems like quite an elaborate greenhouse to have on school grounds, but maybe that's a thing outside of the UK. Either way, this appears to be post-time skip based on Tatsuki's hair, so I wonder when this takes place. Could it be from before Ichigo got his powers back? Orihime is seen looking at a fire lily, which, as we've mentioned before, has been used to symbolize Ichigo in the past, including during the first 1000-Year Blood War arc opening. Orihime mentions to Tatsuki that the flower reminds her of Ichigo, and while Tatsuki agrees that Ichigo is as red as the fire lily, she points out that he resembles this other more bright orange flower instead. As Orihime turns to leave, she glances back at the lily, and it bursts into flames. To Orihime, the flower was never meant to represent Ichigo's exterior, but his heart, noting it must be the same colour. As we return to the present, we see Orihime charging up the stairs behind Ichigo. He's reflected in her eyes, much in the same way he is in the new opening, and as they run, Orihime thinks to herself how Ichigo's heart is warm, kind, and shining bright, its light on all that exists around it, trying to protect everything. The anime shows us a few scenes from the past, highlighting small aspects of their relationship to date, from Orihime speaking on Ichigo as he battles Byakuya in the Soul Society arc, to witnessing his holification during his fight against Grimmjow. These are interesting scenes for the anime to pick. Obviously, Orihime was, kind of terrified of Ichigo's holification, so I think this is not supposed to be showcasing a blanket good thing, but I think instead it's just meant to show us that Orihime has experienced and understands firsthand not only Ichigo's journey, the ups and the downs, but what it means for Ichigo to protect those he cares about, and the lengths he will go to as well. What's cool about this is that it will likely be revisited in a couple of episodes' time when Ichigo releases the Horn of Salvation. As in the manga, when Orihime sees it, she sees that recognizable horn, she will be horrified, and think back to what took place atop the dome of Las Noches, when Ichigo's protective instinct truly took over, and when she was the most afraid. But going back to the episode, interestingly, the first image shown here, the one of Orihime on the phone, isn't an old shot from the original anime, it is brand new, and taken from the omake of chapter 672, the same one where she realizes she can finally fight beside Ichigo after all this time. And that's because that omake was itself originally a reference to this moment from chapter 58, where Orihime calls Chad to tell him that she's made up her mind, and she will be heading to the Soul Society with the others to help protect Ichigo. And I love that. I love that Kubo not only remembered that and included it here in the manga, but that the anime then went the extra step to add it in. It's a vital part of Orihime's character development, and we're finally here, now, at the end, where everything comes full circle for her, and she's not only able to fight alongside Ichigo, but she's literally about to help him battle the final boss. As she and Ichigo continue up the stairs, we're shown a close-up of Orihime's hairpins, which itself takes the shape of a six-petaled flower, and of course the representation of Orihime's resolve and her own desire to protect, which is why her powers manifested in the first place. Orihime then declares this is why she, but it's then cut off. I have to assume it's just Orihime once again resolving to protect Ichigo no matter what, as they head into the most dangerous fight they've ever been involved in. But this time, Orihime is actually going to be actively engaged in the battle, fighting as Ichigo's equal. Honestly, this opening is all a really nice new addition to the story, and was clearly included to help flesh out the culmination of Orihime's character arc, which in the manga did feel a little rushed. However, after this, we then find ourselves back in manga territory with chapter 664, as Askin reveals his Volstendish Haschwalth in preparation for his fight with Kisuke. Now, for this initial portion of the battle, we stick pretty rigidly to the manga. I will say, as Askin descends, there is a really awesome and surprising new track playing in the background, which I believe is the theme for his holy form. It's kind of creepy and off-putting, but I also love it, and I think it works really well. Later on, it has a sort of techno vibe that also makes a ton of sense for Askin's bio-warfare themed abilities. Also, Askin's Haschwalth really does look great here. I've always loved the effect the anime uses for the Quincy Volstendish, and the glittering purple is a fantastic touch. I also always found it kind of funny that one of the changes to Askin in his Volstendish was just that he gets a pair of glowing trousers. But it is a totally badass form too, with his cool visor and awesome, very unique molecular wings, and it's emblematic of the best kinds of Volstendish in my opinion, where the base of the character doesn't really change too much, but they gain a number of accessories on top. In the manga, it was only really Askin and Kirige who had Volstendish of this style, but the anime has given them to a large number of the Sternritter, basically all of the Bambis, plus the likes of Robert as well, thanks to the inclusion of Sclavarai pretty much across the board now. From a writing perspective, there's no doubt though that this form suffers from probably the single biggest issue that plagues fights in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Basically, this form seems specifically designed to counter the previous ability in the fight. Yoruichi could change her Reiatsu 48 times a second. Never mind, Haschwalth now adapts to the changes in a poison. So long as the poison's base remains the same, Askin's new power can instantly nullify it, which basically means no one can hurt him. I mean, it's kind of insane when you think about it, right? It basically means he becomes completely immune to all Reiatsu, essentially. But of course, this distinction in Askin's power will come into play later on. He notes that as long as the base remains the same, it doesn't matter how much the surface level changes. Now, Askin is already immune to Grimmjow's Arrancar Reiatsu, but the base of Grimmjow's Reiatsu, as we'll see a bit later on, is going to change. I wonder what Kisuke was about to use before Askin shut it down. Was he just going to inject Yoruichi with another immuno-enhancer and try and get her back on her feet? Anyway, Askin's voice actor, Shunsuke Takeuchi, is having an absolute blast hamming it up here as the villain, and I really do love it. And again, the music just takes off as he locks the Gift Bear Ike into place. By the way, the anime is really great on the little details here. When Askin revealed his Volstendish at the end of chapter 663, he was adorned in all manner of peculiarities, such as a modular belt that wrapped around his waist and various orbs that lined his arms. By the time chapter 664 rolled around, however, most of these extraneous add-ons were completely removed. And when Askin holds out his arms to release the Gift Bear Ike, the orbs kind of just appeared in the sky behind him. Here in the anime, though, said orbs lift from his arms and into the air, cementing the Gift Bear Ike in place. I feel like this is always how it was meant to be in the manga, but the simple fact is, they were all inexplicably gone. I do love the animation of the orbs slamming into the Gift Ball Deluxe above to form the Bear Ike. It's really nice. But with the Bear Ike now in place, Askin tells Kisuke that it is completely impossible to escape. Again, great little character moment here, where Askin kind of inadvertently dunks on basically every Bleach villain ever by explaining that he's not fond of speaking in absolutes, as people who do tend to appear not in control. Back in the day, one of the reasons myself and others liked Askin so much was the simple fact that he actively bucked the trends laid out by most Bleach bad guys, especially many of the Sternritter who had been and gone not that long ago. Askin, on the other hand, seemed totally genre-savvy and self-aware, as though he knew he was in a shonen manga, and seemed averse to making the same mistakes as those who came before. And again, many of the Sternritter fell into many of the same traps, and Askin seemed to avoid them all. It was like Kubo knew all of a sudden, and was messing with people. But yeah, this is taken straight from chapter 664, as Kisuke and Askin have a fantastic little chat. Kisuke is surprised to see Askin trying so hard to prevent them from escaping, to which Askin remarks, well, of course he is, they're enemies. But Kisuke isn't totally convinced. He muses that Askin doesn't seem to be acting entirely out of loyalty, which again is a far cry from the majority of the overly zealous Sternritter. Askin reveals that while he has at least twice the loyalty of a Pomeranian, Kisuke does have a point. Loyalty isn't everything. Instead, he finds Yhwach interesting. Yhwach, of course, wants to destroy the three worlds and build something new, something unseen in their place. Who else but Yhwach could achieve that? If Askin were to turn his back on Yhwach and lose him here, who else would take his place? As Askin remarks that Kisuke looks like a man who has seen all there is to see in the world, Askin reveals that he wants to see what kind of a world Yhwach will create after destroying the current three, and believes that surely Kisuke must be curious to see it as well. As I've said before, firstly, it is fantastic that Kubo gives Askin his own motivation, one that truly sets him apart from the vast majority of Sternritter, whose motivations are either non-existent or extremely thin on the ground. Basically, they want to serve Yhwach in some way. Maybe they want something from him or they're scared of him, but that's generally what it boils down to. Askin isn't the same. He wouldn't serve Yhwach if he knew there was someone else that could achieve the same goal. But as far as he's concerned, there isn't. Askin wants to see the new world that's made from the ruins of the current three. It's a surprisingly dark and frankly evil motivation for a man who has so far been perhaps the goofiest Sternritter, but then that's what he's all about. Askin makes you underestimate him before then turning on a dime and actually revealing himself to be one of the most sinister and dangerous of the bunch, and apparently that also extends to his mentality. Unsurprisingly, he's very akin to Kisuke in that way. However, they're not alike in this way. Seemingly angered by Askin's question, Kisuke suddenly swings for him with his blade, Askin darting backwards with his really awesome and unique Hirenkyaku, which creates a molecular pathway underneath him. This cool Hirenkyaku effect was in the manga, but I believe it only appears this one time. Anyway, Kisuke replies, saying that maybe someone like Mayuri would have agreed in wanting to see something new. But even he wouldn't want to just sit back and see what Yhwach creates. Instead, if you want something created that no one has ever seen before, it should be done by your own hand. That's what it means to be a scientist. It's an interesting and compelling dichotomy. It feels like Kisuke is angrier about Askin simply wanting to sit back and let someone else do the dirty work, rather than what Askin is actually wanting to see. Though as a defender of the status quo, Kisuke doesn't want to see the three worlds destroyed either. It feels like he is admonishing Askin from the perspective of a scientist. But Askin, as far as we know, isn't a scientist. And that's interesting too. The Vandenreich doesn't really have its scientist trope character. Askin, I guess, kind of comes the closest, thanks to his poison and immunity powers, and of course his molecular imagery, his visor. But he's fundamentally different from Kisuke in this way, and I love it. Aside from simply existing on two opposite sides of a war, Kubo invokes a more personal disagreement between them as well, which really works. This isn't like Kyoraku and Stark, where you can't help but think if they weren't fighting on opposite sides, they might be able to get along. This is Kubo showing us that these two characters can never see eye to eye. And again, as I noted in a previous video, this is when I kind of knew Askin was going to die, when his motivation was revealed to be, well, monstrous, even if by proxy. But again, Askin, completely defying the traits of almost every other Sternritter, doesn't explode with rage or lose his mind at the thought of Kisuke denying who he is. Instead, it's the total opposite. He grins broadly and accepts Kisuke's answer as one he likes, as a good answer. But that doesn't change things, they're fundamentally opposed. Regardless of what Kisuke says, Askin reveals that he would still rather see Yhwach's creation, and the battle is on. During the interview portion of the cinema showing, Kubo used this particular panel of Askin to explore just how much a facial expression can actually mean, how much it can convey. Revealing this look of Askin's is basically him saying up to 4 things at once. That was a cool answer, feeling regret that he didn't think of something that cool to say himself, disappointed that he actually has to kill Kisuke now, and so on. It was a great bit of insight. But Askin releases one of the bracelets on his arm, throws his hand up into the air, and conjures Gift Ring, the bracelet expanding to take the form of a huge poison ring. I love the animation that to activate this ability, Askin spins the bracelet on his wrist, and it keeps spinning. You hear it continue to spin even as he lifts his arm up. In fact, all of this sequence just looks wonderful. Askin flings Gift Ring at Kisuke, but it vanishes almost immediately, and suddenly the ring, now much smaller, appears inside Kisuke's eyes. A really nice, small but really nice moment of body horror from Kubo, before bursting them in a shower of blood, blinding the shopkeeper. Askin reveals that Gift Ring concentrates the power of the death dealing on a single spot, allowing him to instantly kill his target. Askin notes that Kisuke is simply too strong, and has left him with only one option. He now has to destroy every single one of Kisuke's organs, which presumably means he can use Gift Ring as many times as he likes. So I don't know why he doesn't use it again in this fight. But of course, Kisuke, now blinded and on his knees, is left with only one last resort. Clutching his cane in his hand, he finally utters the word that certainly back in the day, many of us had waited something stupid like 15 years to hear. Bankai. As we reach the cliffhanger of chapter 664, Kisuke's Bankai appears, a gigantic wooden doll who emerges from behind a shadowy veil as if being moved by a crank hidden backstage. The doll resembles Benihime, the Crimson Princess herself, and she towers over Kisuke, her arms outstretched as if in an embrace. I'm not going to delve into all of the changes and similarities between Kisuke's Bankai in the manga and the anime here, as I made a pretty exhaustive video on the Bankai itself just the other day. And I'd recommend you check that one out if you haven't done already. But suffice it to say, the anime has taken my favourite Bankai to the next level. Whereas the reveal of Kisuke's Bankai undeniably felt a little rushed in the manga, and indeed with barely 20 chapters to go until the end of the series, this was absolutely when Kubo was struggling the most. Here, the anime fleshes out the fanfare surrounding the introduction of this much-anticipated ability. The eerie, mystical music is absolutely perfect, making Benihime appear to be something otherworldly as she emerges from beyond the darkness. And overall, everything about this just looks fantastic. Again, I urge you to check out my last video if you haven't done, for a more in-depth look at the Bankai itself, and how it's presented here in the anime compared to the manga. I'll be totally honest, I've never quite understood how the Vandenreich doesn't have information on Bankai like Kisuke's or Kyoraku's, even if they do very rarely get used. There's simply no way they haven't once used their Bankai in the Seirete in the last 1,000 years. 1,000 years, even for Shinigami, is an enormous amount of time. That encompasses Kisuke's and probably Kyoraku's entire lifespan. When both of them became captains, they likely would have revealed their Bankai to someone at some point, even if just to pass the acceptance test. I guess it's totally possible they didn't reveal all their Bankai could do, but it's always felt a little odd to me. The Vandenreich have literally been watching the Shinigami from the shadows for a millennium, and know virtually everything there is to know, but they somehow don't know anything about these. Ukitake knows what Kyoraku's Bankai is, so when and where did he see it? I guess Kyoraku might have shown it to him in the Rukongai maybe, but again, why? It's not like they knew to avoid revealing anything specific in the Seirete. Maybe it was to avoid casualties. After all, in the anime, we see that Chojuro revealed his Bankai to Yamamoto in the Rukongai. But then, if that was the case, how did Ukitake see Kyoraku's Bankai without being swept up in it? Either way, Kisuke reveals that Kanonberaki Benihime Aratame's ability is to reconstruct anything it touches, dissecting Askin's arm right in front of him before restoring Kisuke's destroyed eyes. Kisuke leaps towards Askin, carving his sword through the air before slashing the Sternritter across the shoulder as reams of stitches follow the Shinigami. As Kisuke rides said stitches around the battlefield in a new moment, he spins back around and clashes with Askin, sparks flying as the two lock weapons. It's kind of funny that almost immediately after showing us Kisuke cutting Askin's shoulder, the anime then shows a close-up of Askin where he doesn't have a wound. But there you go. Of course, this little showcase of Kisuke riding his stitches like rails is totally new. And what you'll see here is that this fight incorporates essentially the exact same structure as the manga, made obvious by the dialogue, but it's simply then embellished with new action. As Kisuke reconstructs his hand to remove the poison of the Gift Ball Deluxe, he also makes it physically stronger as well, and sends Askin flying by massively overpowering him. We then get another new sequence of Kisuke zipping around the battlefield, using his sword to cut open space in front of him, before riding on the stitches as his Bankai quickly sews it back up again. However, as Kisuke sails towards Askin, the Sternritter reveals himself once more, several brilliantly lit molecular nodes sprouting from the ground behind him. Askin laments that despite forcing Kisuke to fight on his own terms inside the Gift Ball Deluxe, Kisuke's Bankai has effectively undone that. In another new piece of action, Kisuke leaps towards Askin again and the two of them lock weapons once more. This time Askin pushes Kisuke back and at the same time conjures a wave of additional gift balls, which Kisuke then carves through. Askin then tells Kisuke that he isn't perfect, however, and that he's still trapped inside the inescapable Poison Fortress as the Gift Ball Deluxe begins to change shape. The power of the poison within heightening and amplifying as Askin summons a huge swath of gift balls. And this is what I mean, all of Askin's dialogue is taken straight from the manga. None of what he says here is new. But the anime has fleshed out the spaces between, with totally new battle sequences, which is really great. As Kisuke reconstructs his own foot, again it's weird that the purple coloration doesn't disappear this time, he evades all of the gift balls but Askin conjures even more, including a gigantic one that threatens to swallow Kisuke whole. Whipping himself through the sky atop the back of his stitches, Kisuke leaps over the giant gift ball and dives down through the rest of the poison orbs, attempting to reach Askin. Just as he does, however, Askin vanishes, reappearing behind Kisuke and smacking him in the back with his staff, sending the Shinigami slamming into a building below. I appreciate the additional physicality this fight has to it now. Askin himself says that the battle has turned into a fight of physical strength, which he doesn't like. But in the manga, they never clashed again. Here, we do see them actively tussling with one another in a much more deliberate and effective way. As Kisuke muses that he can barely crawl on the ground at the rate the poison's affecting him, that line feels like more of a sarcastic quip than it did in the manga, due to the fact that, well, Kisuke isn't even running in the anime. He's not even using his legs or feet, really. He's riding the rails, so to speak. But of course, as Askin lands on a nearby building, Kisuke notes that it's too late. When suddenly a fountain of blood erupts from the Sternritter's chest. Just want to tell you a quick personal story. When this chapter released, I was working in a game store here in the UK, and I would kind of, sneak into the storage room to read the newest chapter whenever it came out on my phone, if I was working at the time. And I was working when this chapter came out. And I remember getting towards the end of the chapter, I was in the storage room, and I was just kind of hoping that Askin wasn't going to die just yet. And I remember seeing the page that ends with the huge blood splatter. And I remember thinking to myself, on my phone, sequestered away in secret in the storage room, I was like, oh no, this is it. Maybe it's not too bad. I was hoping maybe it's not like an obvious death. Maybe he'll somehow be saved. I turn the page, and it's like the most obvious death that Bleach has ever had. Apart from maybe someone's head getting cut off. I remember audibly being like, no, because Askin was there with his heart outside his chest. I remember thinking this is ridiculous. An arm has punched right through Askin's back, tearing out his heart in what is probably one of Bleach's craziest and most violent shots ever. As Kisuke notes that while Askin said the Gift Ball Deluxe was inescapable, he never said it was impenetrable. And so Kisuke has been secretly working on using his Bankai to manufacture a path into the ball from the outside. With a wry smile, a weary Kisuke thanks none other than Grimmjow for his help, as the Espada in his Resurrection crushes Askin's heart in his hand. That then takes us to chapter 666, as the Sternritter collapses to the ground. The anime adds the effect of Askin's blue vein here, which is cool, which has activated to try and keep him alive. In general, the anime has been much better about including blue vein, while it was, let's be honest, totally forgotten in the manga after a while. If we assume that most high-level Quincy have blue vein running in some capacity most of the time, then it's probably heightened here, as Askin had just taken massive damage, and it's almost trying to protect him after the fact. It's a little weird that the anime keeps Kisuke's line where he says he healed Grimmjow on the way here, when the anime went out of its way to show Yoruichi was healing Grimmjow before Kisuke had even left the Gotei 13's main group, but I digress. I'm also surprised that Askin's Volston dish doesn't just immediately shut off once he's taken such a huge, fatal injury, but I guess again the blue vein is kind of keeping him in stasis for a few precious minutes. It's kind of interesting that the anime is seemingly using blue vein to maybe explain why Askin hasn't died yet, but in the manga, I always just assumed it was down to the fact that back when Askin gets back to his feet against Oetsu, he lets us into a tiny bit about his past where he says that the reason he was picked up by His Majesty in the first place was because he just wouldn't die. And so I kind of thought that's what was happening here as well. Either way, Kisuke reveals that Grimmjow being in Resurrection was the key to their victory, as his Oranka Reiatsu reverted back to pure Hollow Reiatsu upon doing so, meaning Askin was no longer immune, and Haschwalth wouldn't be immune to this attack, as the base of Grimmjow's Reiatsu has changed. Now, this next sequence is taken again straight from the manga. Askin is amazed that Kisuke seemingly saw so far ahead, but Kisuke simply tells him that he prepares for every single scenario before a battle, potentially planning for 1,000 different eventualities, and if even a single one comes true, then it was worth it, and that preparing yourself to death to avoid death is something everyone does. Grimmjow then stabs Askin again, this time trying to finish him off properly. He then tells Kisuke that killing his enemy was the extent of their agreement, and now their contract is done. Again, I've said it before, but it's never explained what Grimmjow gets out of this contract. Kisuke tells Ichigo back in chapter 518, or episode 8, that he and Grimmjow made a little deal after Grimmjow saved them from Kirige, but again, we never learn what the Espada actually gets out of this. I always assumed Kisuke promised him he would set up a fight with Ichigo, perhaps, if Grimmjow helps them kill their enemies, but we never know. But as Grimmjow tries to leave, he suddenly collapses to one knee as poison courses through him. Kisuke also realizing something is wrong. Still clinging to life, Askin reveals that when he dies, the effect of the gift ball deluxe magnifies enormously. The lock that he placed on it unconsciously out of fear for himself is released, and there's now nothing he can do about it. It's a little similar to Barragan's Respirar in that sense, I guess. Of course, I've always loved the fact that, again, Askin says he wanted to spare Kisuke out of respect, but also that he expects him to have an answer to this situation as well. Smirking, Askin notes that he is sure Kisuke has a way out, so for the first time, he won't say the situation is fatal after all. And with that, my favourite Sternritter collapses and dies at last, the effects of the Gift Ball Deluxe spreading like wildfire as purple reishi nodes shoot up into the sky, filling the toxic void from one side to the next. Pinned to one knee, Grimmjow, spluttering, his voice laced with strain, barks that there's no way he'll let this thing kill him, while outside, Nell realises that one of the 5 possibilities Kisuke suspected really did end up happening. Therefore, they do indeed have a contingency plan. Despite wanting to meet up with Ichigo, Nell instead blasts towards the Gift Ball Deluxe, preparing to rescue those trapped inside: Urahara, Grimmjow, Yoruichi, and Yushiro. As Kisuke crumples to the ground, violently coughing up blood, he wonders if this is the end for him, before apologising for having to leave the rest to Ichigo, Rukia, and everyone else. To be fair, he is at the end of his rope, and he's leaving his fate in Nell's hands. With Benihime collapsing behind him, signalling Kisuke's near-death state, his stitches reopening on his face, he falls unconscious, the remnants of his Bankai fading away around him. It's interesting, most of this is exactly the same as the manga, save for one small detail. In the manga, when Kisuke utters his final words, he only mentions Ichigo and Rukia. And this was always a little weird, but it made some sense to me. Kisuke has obviously been around since the very, very beginning, prior to even the first appearance of the Gote 13. And his relationship with Rukia was also one of the earliest to be established, so it makes at least some sense that he might think of her at what could be the end. But even so, it does feel a little unlikely, and I think it was simply done to call back to the start of Bleach. But here, the anime also adds everyone after he names those two, thereby kind of dialing back the individual significance of their names. Also, it was always weird in the manga, because Rukia ended up doing nothing and playing no real role in the final battle, whereas here in the anime, I'm fully expecting that to change. But yeah, with that comes the end of the fight that I was the most excited to see from the Varvelt arc, and I think the anime completely knocked it out of the park. It was extraordinarily well handled, and I couldn't be happier, really, to be totally honest. All of the characters involved were either treated with a reverence that sticking faithfully to the manga, including its artwork, really shows, or the fight was expanded in an interesting way. Would I have preferred it to be longer still? Sure, I would, of course. But I'm glad it was extended at all, to be honest, and Kisuke's Bankai really was brought to life in a phenomenally good way, when again, I feel like it would have been so easy to get it wrong. Now, inexplicably, in what I think is one of the craziest things from the manga, this is the last time we ever see Kisuke Urahara, and the likes of Yoruichi, and the likes of Grimmjow, and the likes of Nell in the manga. So I'm wholeheartedly expecting that not to be the case this time around, even if they only reappear in the epilogue. I definitely think we will be seeing these characters again. I certainly hope so. I will be keeping an eye out for them to see if they get the closure they deserve. Anyway, there's still a few pages of chapter 666 left to cover, but not this time. Instead, the anime skips right the way to the end of chapter 672, taking us past the entire Gerard fight, right to where Ichigo and Orihime find themselves outside the door to Yhwach's throne room. But here, Ichigo finally says that he's counting on Inoue to have his back, even as they prepare to face the toughest opponent in the entire series. And this, of course, loops back round to the new scene at the start of the episode, as Orihime realizes the time has finally come. She can finally fight to protect Ichigo as she's always wanted to do. She's no longer a burden, she's no longer in the way. This is her moment, and I think tying this scene from the manga into that earlier new anime edition is a great way to do it. As chapter 672 comes to an end, Ichigo pushes open the throne room door, and Yhwach welcomes his son of darkness. It would have been kind of funny if Ichigo went to open the throne room door and it was just locked. Like, there was this dramatic moment and then the door just doesn't move. Anyway, moving into chapter 673, we skip over the first few pages, as again the reactions to Ichigo arriving in Yhwach's throne room from across Varvelt can't really happen until after the Gerard fight, as it shows not only Rukia and Renji discovering Gerard's new form for the first time, something that we have actually seen in the trailer by the way, but also adult Hitsugaya as well. And I am interested to see what all of this means. Presumably this means the reactions have maybe been cut entirely, unless these characters all react to something else later on down the line, like, say, Ichigo's true Bankai, perhaps. Speaking of cuts, there's no doubt the anime is cutting far less from the manga than it was doing in Cores 1 and 2. That much is obvious. Things have been restructured and moved around more than ever, sure, but the vast majority of the manga is actually making it into the episodes now, which is good. I mean, it was anyway, but I used to have to talk for ages about the various cut content. Anyway, as Ichigo and Orihime enter Yhwach's throne room, Yhwach notes that he can almost see Ichigo's overflowing spiritual pressure taking form, similar to how Yamamoto's power took on the shape of flames in Bankai. In the manga, I always thought the shape of Ichigo's power here was meant to vaguely resemble the teeth of his hollow mask, but in the anime it doesn't seem to at all. Now, I know I just mentioned that there is less cut content than ever, but actually we do have a tiny bit here to address. As Ichigo approaches Yhwach in the manga, and he asks where Ichigo will attack from, Ichigo shuts him down, telling Yhwach that He already knows the Quincy King can see where Ichigo is going to attack, thanks to the Almighty. However, Yhwach, somewhat inexplicably, simply states that he won't use his power, as he wants to enjoy this conversation with his son. In the anime, this little exchange is completely removed, and they skip ahead to talking about Isshin and Masaki instead. Now, I find this to be a curious omission. Why remove it? Yhwach's the Almighty can still do the same thing it could in the manga, right? Now, I've always thought that Yhwach just outright not using his ability to preserve in some way the integrity of the scene was an admission of it being too broken in a sense, and maybe the anime is trying to avoid that. The Almighty itself is being changed up in a fairly sizable way, as we'll see in a moment, and I wonder if that will come back to play here in some form. Yhwach notes that Ichigo now knows the origin of his powers, and thus the Quincy King is his father, as Isshin is merely a stand-in. But as Ichigo roars at Yhwach, adamant that he isn't his father, and is instead the man who killed his mother, he lunges for him, unleashing a golden Getsuga Tensho. We then leave chapter 673 to cut back to Uryu versus Haschwalth and some more brand new fight scenes, and we find ourselves immediately following up from where we left them last time. Uryu conjures a number of arrows which blast Haschwalth, but the Sternritter Grandmaster destroys them all with a swing of his almighty-infused sword. As Uryu leaps over Haschwalth, we get a great little sequence where he flies throughout the building, leaving several traps on the walls around him, which Haschwalth then triggers. A plethora of arrows blast the Grandmaster from all sides, and despite his future sight, Haschwalth is actually struck by a number of them and sent falling to the ground far below. I love that Uryu is actually, for now at least, truly holding his own against Haschwalth. I know we've seen these episodes before, and potentially there's more new stuff still to come, but I just can't get over how different this really is. However, as Uryu readies an arrow to blast Haschwalth with, featuring an animation error where Uryu isn't in his completed Volstendish, as this is taken straight from his battle with Renji in episode 33, the power of the Almighty actually begins to pull the arrows out of Haschwalth's body, and it even begins to heal his wounds, implying the power to alter the future itself. The power of the Almighty forms a shadowy black shield in front of Haschwalth, a reference perhaps to his Frun shield, and this is where it really begins to feel as though the anime is going to deviate from the manga in a pretty big way. Haschwalth notes that Uryu sending Ichigo to kill Yhwach while he didn't have access to the Almighty seemed like a reasonable plan, but it was a mistaken one. As the dark of the Almighty pours from Haschwalth's eyes, running down his face, we are treated to another totally new and amazing soundtrack, one that I'm fairly sure is chanting Yhwach in the background, but I might be mistaken. We then return to chapter 673, as Ichigo tries to strike Yhwach with his Getsuga, only to be blocked by an enormous wave of black energy. In a new line, Ichigo recognizes this as the Soul King's power, and I'm very glad to see that. This will be an even bigger deal next episode, but the fact the Soul King is still being actively mentioned is a great sign for things to come, and I'll cover that more next time. Fighting alongside Orihime, who defends Ichigo from Yhwach's power, Ichigo rushes the Quincy King and tries to attack him, only to be stopped mere inches from the man's face. Yhwach gloats that Ichigo has nothing to be sad about regarding his mother, as she fulfilled her purpose in life, giving birth to Ichigo and then dying for Yhwach, and she couldn't have wished for greater happiness. As Ichigo is flung into a nearby pillar, Yhwach begins to ominously rise from his throne, the Soul King's energy gathering around him once more, as we reach the end of chapter 673. Returning to Uryu versus Haschwalth, Uryu fires his arrow at the Grand Master, but something blocks it. The Almighty, the Soul King's dark power, which coalesces in front of Haschwalth. Although Haschwalth commends Uryu for trying to go after the Almighty, the reality is he was overly arrogant. Haschwalth is then draped in a totally new form, the shadowy power of the Almighty curling around his neck like a scarf, completely running down his arm and his hand and flowing onto the Grandmaster's sword. This is again a completely new, anime-exclusive transformation for Haschwalth, and as if to hammer home just how crazy these changes are, the extent of these changes, both Uryu and Haschwalth are now fighting one another using anime-exclusive forms. And again, in the interview section of the showing at the cinema, The anime team basically said that they were going to give Haschwalth a Volson dish before remembering actually that's not how his powers work. So instead, this form is meant to be the equivalent of that to some degree, and Kubo himself even drew them a sketch of this transformation. But a pair of eyes slide into view upon Haschwalth's scarf, Uryu's form reflected in them, much in the same way the events of Core 3 were seen upon Yhwach's eyes in the previous episode. So the question is, what does this all mean? In both the manga and the anime, Uryu makes a point of the fact that Haschwalth doesn't have full control over the Almighty's power. Perhaps now, Haschwalth will also have the ability to change the future. Is it Haschwalth himself that's doing this, though, or is it Yhwach who's capable of remotely wielding his power who is doing this for Haschwalth? Is it akin to how Yhwach's Soul King power is seemingly controlling the stone statues and the Soldat? Now his power is also flowing into Haschwalth, and perhaps, just maybe, this will play into Haschwalth's ultimate defeat if Yhwach suddenly decides to take said power back. Either way, this is again an undeniably momentous change, and I think it's only going to get crazier from here on out. As we reach the end of the episode, however, we find ourselves in chapter 674, as Ichigo continues to charge at Yhwach, the Quincy King's Soul King power, completely overwhelming everything. And I've got to be honest, normally I've found Yhwach's Soul King power to look much better in the manga, but here it does actually look really cool, and they do a great job of making it feel totally insurmountable. There are a few new little pieces of action here, specifically when we see Ichigo trying to fend off the Soul King's power, as it leaves almost burn-like marks on the floor, but as Yhwach commands Ichigo to expend all of his power and die, the episode comes to an end. Now, interestingly, where has this left us? While the cliffhanger of 674 is still the furthest we've gone, featuring Isshin and Ryuken, this is an intriguing place to leave off, as in the manga, this moment is immediately followed up by a return to the Gerard fight, which once again has still barely begun here in the anime. The poem this week isn't from a volume, instead it's Hitsugaya, showing an image of his broken petal, as he says even the scattering of these petals is a miracle, which is a nice bit of wordplay regarding his battle with Gerard, but also how the falling of those petals, which was once thought to be a bad thing, is actually going to turn out to be rather serendipitous. But in my opinion, Hitsugaya feels like a bit of a weird choice for the poem this time, especially since the falling of his petals won't really occur in any meaningful way until the week after, though I'm assuming this was done because either Kenpachi or Yachiru will be the poem reader for next week's episode. Alas, it's time for our first Sternritter in Memoriam of the final core. And I'm truly sad to say that at long last, it's time for my boy, Sternritter D, the death-dealing Askin Naklavar, to join the ranks of the fallen. I have my little Askin bookmark here for just such an occasion. What a great character. Truly one of the best villains of the arc, and probably my all-round favourite post-time skip Bleach character. There really aren't many Sternritter left, at least based on the anime. Only Lige, Gerard, and Haschwalth remain, and Lige's status is kind of up in the air right now. Again, there's no predictions for next week's episode as we've already seen it, so that's about it from me, I think. Again, this was a fantastic episode, my favourite of the three shown in the cinema. By some margin, I would say, it was very faithful to chapters 664 and 665, while everything else is kind of all over the place. Also, interestingly, the ending for this week's episode was changed, where Ichigo was originally shown basically telling people to wait behind him, potentially Orihime in that initial ending. Now it's Kisuke Urahara who is taking up the mantle of the spotlight of the ending, and I have to wonder if it's going to change every single week. Maybe the next one will be Hitsugaya, maybe the one after that will be Kenpachi. I don't know, but it's a really nice detail, and it's cool to see that they're doing something interesting like that for the final core. But yeah, that's it from me, guys. Thank you so very much for watching this review if you made it all the way to the end. It's a bit of a long one this time, but I had a lot to say. Let me know your thoughts on episode 42, Son of Darkness, down in the comments. I'd absolutely love to read them. Did you enjoy this episode as much as I did? What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? How do you feel about the new content they added? How do you feel about the very minimal cut content? How do you feel about the way this episode portrayed Kisuke's Bankai, Haschwalth's new form, the start of Ichigo and Orihime versus Yhwach? I'd love to know, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Do consider hitting subscribe down below to help support the channel. It does help out enormously. It is greatly appreciated. Videos like this take a long time to make, so your support it goes a very long way, basically, on our journey to reach 300,000 subs. It's only going to be possible with your help, so do please hit that button down below. Check out the Patreon as well to get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, to get all my videos free of YouTube ads, and to get the live reactions to these new episodes, free of most of the alterations that have to be made to get them onto YouTube. On Patreon, it's a probably slightly better viewing experience, so do consider doing that. Again, it would be greatly appreciated. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.